right. So just quickly before we get to our new book, and we'll tell you what it is in a sec. The That Hideous Strength. Um, it's fascinating. I had more heavy thoughts after reading that book than I have for years. That was a really challenging, interesting, sort of provocative book, and it's I don't know. I don't know about you, Walter. It stuck with me after the last page significantly. Was that true for you as well?
It absolutely is true. And I've noticed that in your new, I'll call it long-haired, philosophical Matt phase, you're thinking about transhumanism. You're talking to people about AI and the future of society. I think it sort of kind of set a fire under you, and I can't take credit for that because it was pushed on me by somebody else who had been saying for years that I needed to read it, and I was like, oh, I'll kind of get it off, get this guy off my back, a friend who's
Right.
very religious. And I said, he's saying I have to read it. I'll go ahead and do it. So the same thing happened to me, dude. I mean, I have to thank the original person who gave it to me.
Yeah, it certainly forces you to ask some very serious questions, and it's not many books that can do that. So
Yeah.
just as a last comment on that book, I wanted to note that. But the heaviness of that book may have inspired our next choice.
I think so.
So after we finished That Hideous Strength, sort of off camera, Walter and I were talking, and one thing that's true about both of us is that as boys, one of our first loves was Sherlock Holmes. I don't know what age you were when you started reading Holmes, Walter. I was probably
8.
11 or 12. Oh, really? Okay, it was that early.
But it was in a sort of like golden book of Sherlock Holmes. He has been condensed and made easy in all sorts of editions. And as I remember, it was the story The Speckled Band, which is about a snake that comes into
an American
a room.
snake.
Yeah,
Yep.
an American snake. And it had a big illustration of the snake coming out of the ceiling because it was kind of a locked room mystery. How could anything happen in this locked room? And the novel we're about to discuss is, in a weird way, a locked room mystery, only out of doors. And anyway, that illustration of that snake, that picture of the man in the deerstalker hat, the idea of having a best friend who was always at your side when you solved mysteries, that too was, appealing and encouraging to a young guy. But I think the final appeal of Sherlock Holmes to my childhood self was that it was a way of getting educated and learning and being rational and all the things that school tries to inculcate in you, and making it fun and alive. Like, you wanted to be logical. You wanted to be reasonable. You wanted to find out about the different countries of the world and the different sorts of mud that might be on somebody's trousers, some with more iron content and some with this content. It brought knowledge and being knowledgeable and curiosity, because I think we were probably both curious kids.
Definitely, and it's so interesting that you talked about school, because I remember very vividly feeling like these are the books that we should be reading in school. Like they were having us read these antiseptic novels, and I don't want to talk down about them on this show, but they were always pedantic. They had this very leaden messaging, and it was very hard to get into. Sherlock Holmes, if you read A Scandal in Bohemia, which is one of the first in the first short story collection of Sherlock Holmes, you find out right away that this guy is a cocaine addict who's up all night long, whipping corpses in laboratories. He's totally antisocial. He's rude.
He's on the spectrum.
He's totally on the spectrum. There's something seriously, as Bill Murray would say, there's something seriously wrong with him, and so that's very attractive. So, okay, all of that is prelude to The Hound of the Baskervilles. There are multiple Sherlock Holmes novels. We decided on this one. I mean, I guess it's my favorite of the Holmes novels. I love so many of his stories, though. The Speckled Band is a great one. We did, was it A Study in Scarlet that we did, or the Redhead League? We did once upon a time. But this is a great detective novel, but it's also just a great novel.
Yes,
the characters are wonderful. They're alive, and I don't know, Walter, where do you want to start? Because I thought we would just get to. In every Sherlock Holmes story, there is a moment where the problem is introduced and he decides to take the case, and that's always the setup. Do you want to walk us through what happens in The Hound of the Baskervilles?
Sure.
Or The Hound of the Baskervilles?
Yeah, The Hound of the Baskervilles also was the reboot of the Sherlock Holmes series. It was published in 1901, 1902 in a serial fashion, month by month, in the Strand magazine. But Holmes had been dead for 8 years. Okay, the great era of the two collections of early Sherlock Holmes stories had ended with Holmes's death, and Arthur Conan Doyle, the author, was basically prevailed on, and I don't know exactly why, after a period of being out of the country, actually in South Africa, to restart the Holmes series. And there are no movies at this point. There are no forms of serial entertainment for the people who want, cliffhanger style narratives, except this kind of thing. And The Hound of the Baskervilles was so successful that it is said that people lined up outside of the offices of the magazine to be the first to get the new issue, the new chapter. It was that big a deal. And so as a reboot, he had to kind of, after having killed off the character in a supposed crash from the top of a cliff into a waterfall with his arch enemy, Dr. Moriarty, he had to revive him. And he also, because 8 years had passed, had to reestablish all his characteristics. And what makes the beginning of the Hound of the Baskervilles so good is he's reintroducing us to Sherlock Holmes in a very concentrated way. He's introducing us to his relationship with Watson. And remember, Sherlock Holmes stories are narrated by Watson. They are not
Dr. Watson.
Yeah, they're not Sherlock Holmes telling a story, because he's way too in his head to ever coherently tell his own story, and he's too eccentric.
In fact, he would have contempt for the process of writing.
Exactly, and so why and Watson is kind of like Dr. Watson is kind of the normie friend who is a little bit of a fanboy. He loves coming over to Holmes's apartment. He loves going out into London, into the streets, and solving mysteries with him. He's a little bit more of a man of action, because remember, a Sherlock Holmes story can often include Sherlock just sitting for a few hours, and then we come back and we found out how he's solved the mystery in his head.
It's Watson seems to me always to have a Webley pistol. Or he's the one who's ahead of Lestrade, the inspector, when they go to capture the villain in the end. But yeah,
right. So, as told by Watson, Hound of Baskervilles starts this way: they're taking their tea or having breakfast, whatever they do, in their robes, which is also just incredibly romantic. The idea of the British gentleman in a kind of modest but nice apartment with maybe one servant and a table and a nice wardrobe right outside is London, the most interesting capital in the world at that point. It's 1900. I mean, it's paradise for any civilized person to think about this period before the world wars, and so on. And so they're sitting around doing what they do. In comes a man, the client. And, American
Well,
noir, hard-boiled detective fiction has the same thing, and she's usually a blonde or something who comes in with a
yeah, a
problem.
smoking blonde. Yeah, a
Yeah,
smoking
but
hot
in
blonde.
these,
Yep.
but in the Sherlock Holmes era, it's a man who's a little disgruntled, with a walking stick, and his
Right.
name
Yeah.
is Mortimer.
So yeah, there's just one thing you skipped over one thing that is one of my favorite conventions in Holmes. I just quickly. So two things. You talk about it being a reboot. So
Yeah,
here's the collected Holmes. This is the before Holmes, and this is the after Holmes. So this reboot lasted quite a long time. It was like
I've got
Iron
the
Man
same
died.
thing right here, dude.
That's so funny.
Holmes. If you don't have one of these,
I know. Yeah.
Your home is ill furnished and under equipped.
Mine is old, but doesn't have the strand illustrations as yours.
Yes.
It does.
Mine is a reproduction of the strand, and you'll see the pages have the illustrations. And what's really interesting, if you get this kind of an edition, and they're out there, is that you can see the verbal description of the character, and then you can see the illustrator's picture. And wow, was that illustrator good? All the little details of appearance. Because remember, Sherlock Holmes all about the details. That's the other wonderful thing. You're trying to solve the mystery with him, and it's a procedural. But the character descriptions and the appearance descriptions that Watson gives, because he's the one narrating, and he's a doctor, and he's sort of got that cold way of describing physiognomies in a medical fashion, is matched so perfectly by the illustrations that you go that the art of magazines serial fiction was really at a high point, even in its pictorial aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate for years, and we have a great cartoonist now, Daniel Medina. I used to work with Victor Uhas, who drew that picture of Gogol you can see above my head.
Right.
A very gifted artist, but back then, the relationship between the writer and the artist, especially in periodical fiction, was like a really important thing. And The Strand, I think, has to be one of the most famous ever, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing I wanted to point out is that there's often in the beginning of a Holmes story, like Holmes and Watson are like an old married couple, and they genuinely bust each other's balls constantly. Like, and Watson does give back. Like he'll talk to Holmes about how nobody reads his stupid monographs and stuff like that. But Holmes asks him to inspect a stick that belongs to the next client and guess who he is. And Watson gives a guess, and Holmes seems to praise him. He says, you exceed yourself. Some people without possessing genius have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. And Watson mistakes this for a compliment, and he's briefly happy. And then Holmes shuts the door on him and says, no, I'm not saying you were right. I'm saying that your mistakes led me to figure it out more easily. And so right away, like on the first page, that whole thing starts up again, and it's just hilarious. Like it's just a way of like easing you into the story and making you remember what the whole thing's about. But I'm
Matt,
sorry,
you're absolutely right. It may have one of the reasons I love it is it may have one of the best beginnings of any Sherlock Holmes story, and it's that leisurely restatement of their relationship that is so masterful. And what's funny is that he asks Watson to do a little of his own deduction. Watson does it. Holmes praises him, but in a kind of mischievous and discreet way, and then basically jumps on him and says, you're no genius, but you're a great conductor of the energy that allows me to be a genius. And Watson, so lovable in certain ways, but a bit of a masochist, isn't as angry as you should think he would be. But then Holmes gets his comeuppance, because the client who walks in is probably one of the only clients who matches Holmes for observational acuity
Totally.
and microscopic attention. And he kind of puts Holmes in his place after Watson has failed to. And it is a perfect example of dry British semi-farcical comedy, so well structured you can't believe it. That Holmes gets a little bit of a comeuppance from the client walking in is amazing.
Yeah, the client is a doctor, James Mortimer, and
which allies him with Watson. So now it's suddenly 2 against 1. After Holmes just tried to take down his friends, it's 2 against 1 suddenly.
And he's immediately eccentric. He's kind of a phrenologist. Like, he comes in the door and the first thing he says is like, I had hardly expected so dolichocephalic, which I guess means having a longer head, a skull, or such a well-marked supraorbital development. Would you have any objection to me running my finger along your parietal fissure? So that's what he says coming through the door. This guy's weird. And Holmes has him sit down, then compliments him.
And it's like a duel, though, Matt, because after he says that, then Holmes, to kind of get back, on top in terms of, classification and detail, says, I observe from your forefinger that you make your own cigarettes. Have no hesitation in lighting one. They have a deduction off. It's like a rap battle almost.
Totally. And Holmes loses at the end of this section. It's kind of funny. He doesn't have a snappy comeback. The guy says, well, naturally I came to you, recognizing as I do that you were the second highest expert in Europe. And Holmes is like, wait, what the fuck? Like, the second? Who's the first, right? And the guy mentions there's a Monsieur Bertillon, who is the greatest authority in whatever field. But you're a more practical person, Sherlock Holmes. So I came to you.
And you know what? It's a Frenchman that he mentions.
Right.
And Holmes says, well, if you think he's number one, then why don't you go to him? Shouldn't you be going to him? But I think this is Conan Doyle's little literary joke, because it is thought, and Conan Doyle said so himself actually, that he modeled Sherlock Holmes after the Edgar Allan Poe detective, Maupin.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Conan Doyle's little confession that Sherlock Holmes is really only a junior Maupin. You know what I mean?
Right.
Having this guy come in and put him in his place, compared to this Frenchman, another Frenchman. So then what happens, and this happens a lot in Holmes, Mortimer, who actually points out that he's not a full doctor. But he's a medical man, but some title.
It's it's 4 letters, the acronym. I don't know what it
stands for. It's some title like an osteopath would be in America, where you're not an MD. He then asks to read an account that gives us the legend of the Baskervilles, this noble family out in the moors of Devonshire, which is way down in the sort of archipelago of places in southeast England. Devonshire is kind of the frontier, okay, of England. And he reads this account of the curse of the Baskervilles, and Sherlock doesn't want him to read it. He sort of was like, oh, well, go ahead, because he's been kind of almost bested in this little, rap battle. And, the guy reads it, and it's the story, for pages and pages. We're inside this account. And then when he finishes, he says something like, and it's the story of a curse that flows through this noble family from an original crime when the ancestor basically raped a woman, right? He took a woman prisoner, and then he was killed by a dog, by some kind of hound, by a hellhound. In those days, hounds were the symbols of creatures that come from hell to persecute you for your sins. And when he finishes, he says, "Wasn't that an interesting story?" or something. And Holmes says, "If you like fairy tales."
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you can tell he's a little bit interested.
Yeah.
Because he lets the guy continue. And then he tells the story of what the current mystery, which is about the last Baskerville. The second to last Baskerville. There's a Charles Baskerville who's inhabiting the Great Hall, and he's elderly, and he's been found dead, and the circumstances are very curious.
He's been found dead in another locked room, and it's very important to understand the setting of this story, because beside it being a reboot, it's probably Holmes's or Conan Doyle's greatest experiment in atmosphere. And the seat of the Baskervilles, where the story will eventually move, the castle, the country estate, is way out in this blasted moors. And moors are like prairies in America, only they're wet, they're boggy. And you can sink down in them. And they have kind of spectral outcroppings of granite that are a little like mountains, sort of like the Black Hills of America. And this guy, this latest Baskerville, dies in an alley which has tall hedges on either side, comes out of the house, and then goes into a cottage and has only one gate, which was locked. And yet somehow he is killed in this confined space. And
his footsteps change along the way.
Yes, his footsteps change along the way. And it seems, he was scared to death because it's unclear how he died. So once again, Conan Doyle has set up a logical, or how can I put it, a practical near impossibility that someone could die in this space where no people have access, presumably. But he's moved out of London, which is the usual setting for Holmes stories, to what we would call Gothic land, where there are ghosts and the supernatural could play a role. And what is distinctive about this novel compared to the other Holmes stories is that it asks the question, is Sherlock Holmes, in his devotion to reason, in his devotion to science, perhaps not seeing that the world is run by supernatural forces? And so he's forced to defend his worldview. He's forced to question his worldview by this case. And that makes it a very foundational story for the Sherlock Holmes mystery. Can Sherlock Holmes perhaps admit that a demonic presence from beyond, maybe the devil himself, is the criminal? Or will he find another, more reasonable, British, 19th century, logical positivist explanation?
And Conan Doyle, even though he's created a super rational character who from time immemorial will be cited as one of the great icons of reason over faith, he creates a Gothic horror story that uses all the conventions of the implications of the supernatural in a way that is very convincing. Like what the description of the dead man's face. Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms out, his fingers dug into the ground, and his features convulsed with some strong emotion to such an extent that I could hardly have sworn to his identity. This is the doctor talking. So he dies in a mask of terror, right? And then when Holmes goes on to ask what the doctor saw in the distance, or what a witness saw, he said, "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound."
That's the last sentence of that chapter, by the way. The footprints of a gigantic hound.
So as you say, the setup is will the great detective, the master of reason, penetrate? This doctor is actually thinking this is maybe a continuation of a supernatural curse, and
Yes.
the book doesn't really give away what it thinks about this. The author doesn't at all. There's not a lot of signaling going on. It's kind of respectful towards the idea that it might be a great gigantic undiscovered hound, and this creepy old place in the middle of nowhere that they make sure to tell you that in Devonshire there's not a whole lot for miles around, and it's a scary place to be. And Holmes essentially says, I'll give you, come back in 24 hours and I'll tell you whether or not I'm going to take the case. And that's the setup for the story, right? But so why are we reading this story? Why are we reading Sherlock Holmes? Just mainly because it's fun, I would say. and this is a great example of why we love the written word and this kind of fiction so much. This was the first sophisticated fiction that I think I read as a young person, and it's so vivid and so entertaining, and the characters are so expertly drawn that it reminds you of what makes reading special, right? As opposed to watching television or any of those things, right? And I think it's good to get back into that sometimes.
Well, Matt, it just dawned on me that we're asking that question, and it is true. We're reading it because we both have deep affection for it. We how can I put it? Are in awe of the storytelling. We love the formula, and it gives us a chance to unpack the Sherlock Holmes formula. But one reason we're reading it is, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, it's set in a Great Britain, in an England, in a London that was, I'm afraid, far more appealing to me than the current one.
Yes, that's. I mean, despite it being covered in horse shit and
Yes.
that dreadful Gazagine glow and maybe Jack the Ripper's lurking around in Whitechapel somewhere,
Because
it was interesting.
Sherlock Holmes is never investigating the mystery of the anti-trans comedian.
Right. Right.
Sherlock Holmes is a free mind and a free spirit, living his own way, not hurting anyone. And there are a lot of little hoary British 19th century, at the edge of the 20th century, stereotypes in Holmes. At one point, they talk about Negroes and different races using what were at the time kind of pseudoscientific stereotypes. You can tell that they're in a colonial capital. The new heir to the Baskervilles just comes back from America. Another person has been in South Africa recently. You know that you're at the crossroads of the empire. But this England is not one that would do what it's confident. It's curious. It believes in rationality. It believes in the freedom of the human mind, and it's not frightened.
It's optimistic.
Yeah, it's optimistic. And I think that this is how can I put it? This is my vision of what it was like to live a civilized life in a civilized place.
and it's an incredibly vivid and enjoyable entertainment. I mean, I had to grab this picture before we did this. When I was a kid, I remember watching a basketball game, and I was watching because there was a star player named Keith Lee at Memphis State once upon a time, who was going to be a big star in the NBA. Everybody thought it didn't turn out that way, but he had a teammate named Baskerville Holmes. And the story with Baskerville Holmes was that his mother, when she went into labor and she was in the hospital, she was reading the Hound to the Baskervilles and was so affected by this story that she named her child Baskerville Holmes. So, and
what an awesome name!
right?
I would have happily gone through life being Basker, or Baskerville.
And he was pretty good too. I remember, um, but that's what Holmes does. I mean, people fall in love with these stories, and there's a reason why, as you say, people lined up. The way the Avengers are worshipped by kids now. That's what he was for a time, and you see it everywhere. Like if you watch the show House. House has the same address as Holmes. He's at 221B somewhere in Princeton, and that format of the doctor and the super mind. It just works, and it's beautiful, and it reminds you of why reading is a different and
Yes.
in some ways better kind of entertainment than video is. So that was why I was looking forward to it.
If you go to a Wikipedia entry for the Hound of the Baskervilles, you will see that there have been movies made of this thing in all kinds of countries, including Eastern European countries, including Japan. It was called The Adventure of Mr. Baskerville and a Dog in Japan. That's how they translated it. But they make the movies every 10 years. Like every British thin and aquiline movie star from Benedict Cumberbatch on
Basil
back
Rathbone,
through Peter Cushing has played Sherlock Holmes in this story. This story changed culture. It has inspired cinema, and it's changed lives. It changed my life. I'll tell you how. When I read this book in little rural Minnesota, way out there in my Walter Cronkite watching days of 1970, let's say to 74, and I heard about this place called London, and I heard about this possibility of being a sort of thinking person who's also a person of adventure, who finds the truth that others don't discover. I mean, dude, Sherlock Holmes is a reporter. I mean, he
totally,
really is.
totally.
And when I found out this was possible, I devoted my life to the thought that I would someday live there. And I was able, thanks to all my angels and guardian angels, to go to Oxford University and to look out one day from my room in a tower in a medieval tower at an Oxford college out onto the countryside of England and go, man, I'm happy. I'm where Sherlock Holmes would be. I'm in a little room having tea, just like my hero. And
right.
There are few characters in the history of literature that actually make you want to live their lives. But I remember going down to London to find 221B Baker Street, and
there isn't one, yeah.
Nope.
Mm-hmm.
There's no B. You go and you go like, did I miss it? Did I skip it? Where is it? And it's in that perfect imaginary third space. You can see the street. You can imagine where it would be. You can see Holmes walking down it. And London is preserved well enough that you can still see touches of that Victorian and Edwardian England. But there's no 221B. But it's the realest place on the street.
Absolutely, yeah, and it is commemorated somehow. I forget how, but yeah, and similar to you, he was my first hero. I'm these stories would maybe want to be a writer probably when I was a kid, and I am absolutely sure that even though I had a father who was a journalist and who also had a deerstalker hat because he loved these stories.
Really?
Yes, he did. So there's probably some of that mixed up.
The audience should know, Matt, that your father is one of the handsomest men of his age that I have ever met. I had the privilege of meeting him. I saw him on TV all the time when I lived in New York in the 80s and so on. But I had the privilege of meeting him in Washington one night, and I was like, bam. Like, why is this guy still not on TV? And the idea of him in a deerstalker cap, he could pull it off. I know it.
Totally, and he was 6'4" and skinny like Holmes too, so it was funny. But the he's not a reporter, but he could be. And as a kid, I went through the whole thing of like looking at the scuff marks on people's shoes, and of course, I didn't learn anything by doing that. But it does teach you to observe, and there's a lot that you can get out of these stories. So we'll get to all of that. Please, everybody, if you don't have a Sherlock Holmes book, go grab one, and we hope you enjoy this story. It'll be a lighter read, but a thoroughly enjoyable one.
And also, it's a fall read. Wherever you are, I hope it gets a little chilly this weekend, or it rains, and you can hold up, because I promise you, reading the first few chapters of The Hound of the Baskervilles, with whatever your warm drink of choice is, in a comfortable chair, is one of the great pleasures of being alive.
Absolutely.